The photograph is no bigger than a hand, the kind of print you could misplace inside a coat pocket and never notice until years later. It surfaced in the least dramatic way possible, stuck to the inside cover of an old ledger, hidden beneath brittle receipts and a folded insurance letter that smelled faintly of smoke and paper rot. If this kind of evidence is your kind of rabbit hole, stay close. Leave a like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the first detail your eyes locked onto, because that instinct usually knows before the mind does. On the front, it's a winter street in an early-century mill city. Brickwork dark with soot, trolley rails cutting through slush, storefront windows dead as stone. No Christmas glow, no lamps in the panes, just a long corridor of darkness, as if the town has been held underwater. 3 men stand mid-street in heavy coats and brimmed hats, shoulders hunched against the cold. Their faces are swallowed by grain and shadow, but their posture reads clear, waiting, watching, careful not to get too close to the brick building on the left. That building is the first anchor. A power substation or something close to it, tall industrial windows filmed with grime, an iron service door set into the masonry, the kind of door that exists for crews and keys, not for the public. The street feels staged, not because it's theatrical, but because it's contained. There's no crowd, no panic, no movement blur from people rushing. It looks like the moment after a sound you can't unhear, when everyone is deciding whether to pretend they didn't hear it. Then you see the ground near the base of the brick wall. Half buried in wet snow lies a thick cable with its end torn open, copper strands fanned bright against the dark slush. Beside it, an open padlock rests on its side like something knocked from a mouth, and just beyond the lock, a small metal tool, its shape consistent with cutters, catches a sliver of light. It's not dramatic. It's worse than dramatic. It's ordinary, practical, the kind of detail that turns a blackout into a scene. Because storms don't leave padlocks open on the ground, weather doesn't bring cutters, and in 1913, nighttime photographs weren't casual. A camera at night meant intention, preparation, a reason strong enough to stand in the cold and make an exposure while the rest of the city swallowed its own fear. The ledger belonged to a man named Harold Pruitt, his name stamped inside the cover, his address written beneath in steady ink. A night watchman, according to the estate list. That detail sits heavy. Watchmen are paid to notice what others miss. They know which doors are supposed to be locked and which aren't. They know which silhouettes belong on a street at night and which don't. The folded insurance letter behind the photo reads like a second voice in the room. Clean type, formal tone, a service interruption affecting commercial operations. It avoids the human reality, families in the dark on Christmas Eve, and leans into language that shrinks catastrophe into something manageable, something payable. There's one phrase that keeps repeating in the mind: unauthorized entry. Not mechanical failure, not seasonal strain. Entry. A conservator, Dr. Miriam Halsey, studies the print under angled light and confirms what the eye already suspects. This is not a keepsake. The paper stock and emulsion fit early commercial use, the kind ordered by offices, newspapers, departments, people who needed records, not memories. A retired line mechanic examines the enlarged scan and points to the cable end. It doesn't look torn by tension. It looks worked, pinched, cut. If that line goes, he says quietly, it doesn't just dim a block. It can starve a district. So the story tightens into one question, simple, brutal, impossible to unask. Who needed the city blind on Christmas Eve? The men in the street aren't facing the camera. They're angled toward the service door, as if waiting for something to come through it, or for someone to come back out. The scene doesn't feel like the start of an accident. It feels like the middle of a plan. And once you see that, You can't unsee it. The blackout wasn't just the absence of light, it was a cover. The next morning, the photo stops being a story and becomes a problem to solve. Not in a library, not in a warm office. In a cold room with a scanner humming, a magnifier lamp burning white, and 3 people leaning in like they're over a body. Dr. Miriam Halsey doesn't interpret first. She measures. She captures the print at a resolution high enough to make the grain feel like gravel, then layers the scan with raking light shots that show every dent, every scuff, every place a thumb once pressed too hard. She's looking for one thing: whether the image is honest about what it shows. Early photos can lie by accident, blur, glare, long exposure. But some lies are too clean. The cable at the base of the brick wall is the first cross-examination. A retired line mechanic named Frank Daly studies the enlarged end of it until his jaw tightens. In his world, brakes have signatures. Wind whip makes fibers spiral. Tension snaps create ragged, uneven tears. The copper strands are flattened in places, pinched, then spread, as if a tool bit down, released, bit again. That's not the grid failing, he says. That's someone failing the grid. Then he points at the padlock on the ground. That's the part nobody explains away. Locks aren't physics. Locks are policy. A lock means there was a boundary and somebody crossed it. They try to place the street next, because motive lives in geography. A trolley historian recognizes the track curve and the spacing of the rails. It's not a main thoroughfare, it's the kind of service run that skirts the industrial edge, where municipal lighting, mill power, and streetcar current braided together in awkward compromises. In 1913, cities didn't have the sleek redundancy we imagine today. One wrong cut in the wrong seam could spill darkness outward like ink. That makes the photo more frightening, not because it proves sabotage, but because it shows competence. Whoever did this didn't guess. The ledger's insurance letter is read again with new eyes. Service interruption affecting commercial operations, not public safety, not holiday emergency, commercial operations. The language feels like a hand on the story's throat, steering it away from the human cost. Then there's that phrase again, unauthorized entry. It's the one place the letter admits a person was involved, then immediately refuses to name them. So Claire Alden, the journalist on the team, goes hunting for how a city talked about the blackout when it thought nobody was listening. The newspaper archive offers a brief notice, repairs underway, calm reassurances, and then a strange quiet. For a whole city going dark on Christmas Eve, the coverage is too thin, too polite, too fast to move on. Claire pulls the microfilm for December 26th and finds a pale rectangle where an article should be, the way paper looks when something's been clipped. It could be damage, it could be age, but it sits there like an edited-out confession. When she asks the archivist, the man gives the universal shrug of institutions, lost, missing, probably nothing, the kind of shrug that makes a reporter's skin prickle. Back at the scan, Halsey zooms into the iron service door. The edge shows a dark smear, repeated contact, the kind you get when gloved hands use the same grip over and over. The handle has a faint scuff where metal met metal. Small details, but details don't exist in isolation. They exist in patterns. A door that looks used, a lock that's open, a cable that looks worked. Frank's voice drops when he says the part everyone's thinking. If you can get to that door, you can get to the point that matters. And in that era, getting to that door is a social act as much as a physical one. In 1913, uniforms open more gates than crowbars. A man who looks like he belongs can walk through the night without being questioned, especially on a holiday when people want to believe the world is gentle. That's the shift. The team stops asking, what caused the outage? And starts asking, who could do this without being stopped? Because the photo doesn't show panic. It shows control. The men in the street aren't swarming the building. They're hanging back, as if someone told them to. The street itself feels held, quiet enough to hear a wagon wheel, dark enough to hide one. By the end of the day, they don't have a name. They have something worse, a working theory built from physical facts. Someone reached a restricted point in the grid. A lock was defeated or opened. A line was cut with intent. And the blackout that followed wasn't chaos. It was a window long enough for something to happen that daylight would have made impossible. The first real break doesn't come from a database. It comes from paper that wasn't meant to survive. Claire Alden returns to Harold Pruitt's ledger and opens it the way you open something that might bite. In the back, under a brittle flap of glue, she finds a pay stub folded into quarters, creased like it was handled in secret. Not municipal, not a utility wage, private. Watch Services, it reads, with a simple crest stamped in the corner, a shield with 3 vertical bars. A mill security contractor. In 1913, that stamp is a kind of permission slip. Mills didn't just make cloth, they made power, economic, political, physical. When strikes brewed, when organizers whispered, when the city felt unstable, mills paid men to keep order the way they defined it. And if those men had reason to want the streets dark, they'd know exactly where to stand and who to call. Claire takes the stub to the county courthouse. The clerk behind the counter is polite in the way people get when they're trying to end a conversation without making a scene. Those firms folded, he says. Records were lost. Flooded basement, fires. It happens. He says it too smoothly. Then he adds, quieter, almost kindly, "You're digging up old troubles." That's the first time anyone warns them in the present tense. They pivot to the night itself. Police blotters, fire logs, hospital admissions, everything that should show a city stumbling through sudden darkness. But the official pages behave strangely, short entries, vague language, little urgency. It's the paperwork version of holding your breath. Not a cover-up you can prove, just an absence that feels engineered. A trolley schedule confirms service interruptions. Utility overtime slips confirm crews were deployed. Yet no one seems to have asked the obvious public question, why was access breached at a restricted door? And why did a lock end up on the ground beside a cut line? Claire starts chasing humans instead of institutions. In a retirement home outside town, she meets Etta Carraway, 90 years old, sharp-eyed, her hands trembling only when she touches what matters. Etta keeps a tin of letters her mother wrote while working as a cook at St. Bridget's Industrial Home, one of those places that took children when families couldn't feed them, or when a judge decided poverty was a kind of crime. Etta doesn't like the word orphanage. They weren't all orphans, she says. Some had parents who just lost. One letter is dated December 27th, 1913. The ink is thin, hurried. It describes a terrible dark and wagons in the lane behind the home. Then the line that changes the air in the room. They said we weren't to look out the back windows, not panic. Instruction. Skeptics on the team push back. A single letter isn't proof. Memory is porous. Institutions breed rumor. Claire agrees, out loud. But when she leaves, she's already turning the detail over in her mind like a shard of glass. Wagons move when streetcars don't. Wagons move when streets are dark. Wagons move best when witnesses are told to look away. Back in the lab, Halsey re-examines the metal tool shape near the padlock. In the cleaned scan, a tiny reflective tag glints near the hinge, too small to read, but clearly manufactured, riveted, official-looking. Frank Daly, the retired line mechanic, swears softly. "Tagging like that," he says, "that's issued equipment. That's the kind of thing a department tracks, or pretends to." They enlarge the padlock next. Along one edge is a faint smear of pale paint residue. A utility worker from a neighboring city explains an old habit. Crews dabbed locks and hardware with a specific color mix as a quick ownership mark. City, mill, private. A language of paint. If that residue is municipal, then the lock wasn't brought by an intruder. It was already there, which forces a darker, cleaner possibility. Access didn't require brute force. It required the right key, or the right uniform, or the right name spoken at the right door. In that era, belonging could open a gate faster than tools. Claire returns to the courthouse a second time, this time asking about procurement, locks, cutters, tags. The clerk's patience thins. "You're reading too much into a holiday outage," he says, but his eyes flick toward the hallway, toward the offices behind him, like he's measuring who might be listening. That night, she finds one more document in municipal minutes, an overtime authorization dated December 25th, signed by a foreman approving repair work without public interference. Without public interference. It reads like an instruction to keep people back, to keep questions away, to keep the story contained. The mini-climax hits when they return to the photograph and stop looking at it like a picture. They treat it like a crime scene diagram. They trace sight lines. They map shadow direction. They ask why the camera angle is where it is. And in the deep shadow near the iron service door, a shape resolves. Boxy, close, parked too tight to be incidental. A wagon or a utility cart. And on its side, barely visible through grain and blur, the hint of a crest, shield-like, with 3 vertical bars. The same mark on the pay stub. The blackout wasn't just an outage, it had a signature. The crest is the first thing in this case that behaves like a fingerprint, because it appears in 2 places that shouldn't touch. A private watchman's pay stub and a shadowed vehicle parked too close to a restricted service door on the night the whole city went blind. Claire takes that shield to places that don't advertise what they know. Labor hearing transcripts, mill ledgers, the kind of records written to protect powerful people, not to explain them. In a 1914 testimony buried deep in the back pages, a witness describes auxiliary watchmen hired through contractors, men who weren't police, but who could pass for authority in the dark. The witness mentions something small, almost throwaway. Certain nights they carried issued tools from the utility works because doors opened easier when you looked official. It's not a confession, it's a method. And suddenly, the photograph stops feeling like an isolated scene and starts feeling like the middle panel of a triptych. Access, darkness, movement. They return to St. Brigid's industrial home, not to accuse, but to check what the paper says happened when the lights didn't. County archives hold a thin inventory sheet dated December 25th, 1913. It's not public-facing. It's internal, written in the clipped language of institutions that learned to turn people into entries. Under placements and transfers, 3 names sit with no destinations listed. Next to them, one cold word, released. In the margin, in a different hand, after outage. Etta Caraway reads the names and doesn't recognize them, but she recognizes the pattern. Released is what you write when you don't want anyone to ask where a child went. Her mother's letter, wagons in the lane, don't look out the back windows, suddenly lands with weight, because wagons don't need power. Wagons don't need streetcars running. Wagons only need darkness and permission. Skeptics keep the pressure on, the way you have to in a case built from fragments. After outage could mean anything, they argue. A delayed meeting, a broken schedule, a coincidence in handwriting. So they chase the physical chain around the photo itself, hoping the object can testify where people won't. Dr. Halsey flips the print and studies the back under ultraviolet. A faint purple stamp blooms into partial legibility, municipal style, bureaucratic. enough to make out two words before the rest dissolves into age: claims and debt. The photograph passed through official hands. It lived in a file. Someone treated this moment, this cut line, this open lock, this door, as a liability event worth documenting. And that matters, because it explains why the image exists at all. In 1913, you don't take nighttime photos for nostalgia. You take them when you need proof. Frank Daly finds the next piece in what looks like nothing: the lock. In the cleaned scan, there's a pale smear along the padlock's edge. Paint residue, the kind older crews used as an ownership code. City hardware, mill hardware, private hardware. If the lock carries a municipal mark, then the barrier that was breached belonged to the city, which means the person at the door didn't necessarily arrive like a burglar. They could arrive like an employee. That's the turning point where the story stops being sabotage and becomes something cleaner and more frightening. A controlled outage, staged to look like sabotage if anyone asked. The final confirmation comes from a retired engineer with an old schematic rolled in canvas. He lays it out like a map of veins and points to the junction by the service door in the photograph. "Cut there," he explains, "and you drop the feeder that stabilizes the district." The darkness spreads fast, but it can be restored fast too, if you planned ahead, if you had a crew already authorized. Claire checks the municipal minutes again and finds the line that now reads like an instruction, not an accident. Overtime approved on December 25th for repair work without public interference. Without public interference. Put it together and the shape is hard to deny. A restricted door shows signs of use. A city lock ends up open in the snow. A line is cut with a tool that looks issued. A vehicle bearing a private security crest sits in the shadow. An institution records releases, annotated after outage. The photo is stamped through a claims department. The outage is fixed quickly, quietly, with overtime already blessed. On Christmas Eve 1913, the city didn't simply lose power. The city was switched off, long enough to create a corridor of darkness where movement could happen without witnesses, where the ordinary protections of light and neighbors and streetcars vanished. Then it was switched back on before morning demanded a clean story. The case ends with a conclusion that is both solid and sickening. The mechanism was deliberate and the intent was control. What remains unsolved is the part that keeps the throat tight. The names on that St. Bridget's sheet, the wagons in the lane, and where released really led when nobody was allowed to look out the window. If this story stayed with you, keep a seat here. Leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think happened in that darkness. The part the city never wrote down.